his wounded and dying dragon. He and his brother had been set upon by an enemy fleet just off Dragonstone. Defying his mother's command, Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir, Jaehaerys, mounted his dragon Vermax and flew to rescue his other brother and punish the enemy fleet. But the foolish boy let Vermax be hooked like a trout and dragged into the sea, where he soaked up even more arrows than seawater. His brother disappeared over the horizon or beneath the waves. No one could say for sure. With the loss of 4 dragons, Rhaenyra's only advantage was fading. Luckily for her, over the centuries, House Targaryen had spilled more than blood on Dragonstone. She promised gold and title to any of the Targaryen bastards who could tame the 6 unclaimed dragons on the island. These bastards were called the Dragon Seeds, though most were called Supper. And perhaps the dragons were eventually sated, or bored, but 4 of them accepted riders and were enlisted in Rhaenyra's cause.
After Rook's Rest, Aemond One-Eye took command of the Greens from his crippled and poppy-addled brother. Aemond was the blood of the dragon, and dragons don't cower behind city walls. He marched the king's army north to take back Harrenhal from Rhaenyra's husband, Daemon. But when he and Criston Cole reached the castle, they found the gates open, with Daemon and all his men gone. That night they feasted their victory. Daemon had fled rather than face their wrath. But Daemon was more snake than dragon. As Aemond marched north, he'd flown Caraxes south, slithering past the Green Army over the waters of the God's Eye. One day, King's Landing looked up and saw 2 dragons circling their foul city. Daemon and Rhaenyra had come for her throne, for the city was defenseless. Aemond had taken the king's army from the city, and worse, he'd taken his dragon, Vhagar. Seeing that resistance was hopeless, the small council surrendered the city, the Queen Mother Alicent, and the broken Queen Helena. But not King Aegon. Somehow, despite his wounds and delirium, he had vanished from the city. And so Queen Rhaenyra climbed the steps and seated herself on the Iron Throne. Legend has it that as she left the hall later, blood trickled down her legs and hands, proving the Iron Throne had spurned her. Nonsense. It's a chair made of steel blades. Rhaenyra had wanted it all her life and had sacrificed 2 sons for it. She likely gripped the damn thing too tight.
When Aemond realized that his arrogance had cost him the capital, he mounted Vhagar in a black rage and rained fire onto every village and castle he suspected of disloyalty. Abandoned by Aemond, Sir Criston marched the royal army back to King's Landing, intent on recapturing the city himself. Instead, he was trapped and cut to pieces by the Riverlords, who had sworn to support Rhaenyra's claim. When a new army of Green Loyalists marched up from the Reach and laid siege to the city of Tumbleton, Rhaenyra sent 2 of her Dragon Seeds to lay waste to them. Instead, the Dragon Seeds proved their bastard nature and betrayed her. They burned the city, and all the Black forces garrisoned within. Lucky for her, they didn't turn towards King's Landing, but whored and drank in the ruins with the Greens, who were victorious and somewhat confused.
Rhaenyra now mistrusted all the Dragon Seeds, including the girl who rode with her husband Daemon, hunting Aemond in the Riverlands. She ordered the girl's head be sent to her, but there was a complication. As well as her dragon, the girl had taken to riding Daemon. When Daemon received the Queen's order, he proclaimed it a Queen's words and a whore's work. He sent the girl away at dawn, watching her and her dragon vanish into the morning mists. Then Daemon sent a challenge to his nephew Aemond and flew to Harrenhal, alone, to wait. 14 days later, a shadow blacker than any passing cloud swept over Harrenhal. Vhagar had come at last, and on her back rode one-eyed Prince Aemond. He mocked Daemon for facing him alone. "You have lived too long, uncle." And Daemon replied, "On that much, we agree." Then the old prince climbed stiffly onto the back of his dragon Caraxes, but neglected to fasten the chains that secured rider to saddle. The sun was close to setting when, as one, The two dragons leapt into the sky. Daemon took Caraxes up swiftly until they disappeared into a bank of clouds. Vhagar, older and slower, ascended more gradually. Up and up Vhagar soared, searching for Caraxes. Sudden as a thunderbolt, a shrieking Caraxes dove upon Vhagar. Locked together, the dragons stumbled toward the lake. Caraxes' jaws closed upon Vhagar's neck, but Vhagar raked open Caraxes' belly, and her teeth ripped off a wing. The lake rushed up with terrible speed. Then Daemon Targaryen, who had never fastened his riding chains, stood in his saddle. He leapt from his dragon to Aemon's, and in his hand was Dark Sister, the Valyrian sword of Aegon's sister queen, Visenya. As Aemon One Eye looked up in terror, Daemon ripped off his nephew's helm and drove the sword down into his one remaining eye so hard the point came out the back of the young prince's throat. Half a heartbeat later, the dragons struck the lake, sending up a gout of water so high that it was said to have been as tall as Harrenhal's great tower. The lake boiled with dragon blood, and then was still. Daemon Targaryen was 49 at his death. Prince Aemon had only turned 20. Vhagar, the greatest of the Targaryen dragons, had counted 181 years. Thus passed the last living creature from the days of Aegon's conquest.
Back in King's Landing, Queen Rhaenyra didn't have much time to grieve for her stupid husband. The mad former queen Helena flung herself from a balcony to be impaled upon the iron spikes lining the moat of Maegor's holdfast. That night, the city rose in riot against Rhaenyra, demanding justice for Queen Helena and her murdered son, among other foolish peasant fantasies. In the midst of this chaos, a one-handed fool called the Shepherd began to rant against dragons. Not just the ones of the enemy, but all dragons everywhere. As he pointed to the dragon pit above on the hill, he shouted, "There the demons dwell, this is their city. If you would make it yours, first you must destroy them." The cry went up from 10,000 throats. Kill them! There were 4 dragons housed within the dragon pit that night. By the time the first of the attackers came pouring in, all 4 were roused, awake, and angry. Nobody knows how many men and women died that night. Who cares? They all should have. Trapped within the pit, the dragons could not fly. Instead, they fought with horns, claws, teeth, and fire. For every man who died, 10 more appeared, shouting that the dragons must die. One by one, they did. Finally, the last remaining dragon broke her chains, spread her wings, and flew straight up at the Great Dome, trying to flee. Already weakened by dragon flame, the dome cracked under the force of impact, and then tumbled down, crushing dragon slayers and herself.
High atop the Red Keep, Queen Rhaenyra clutched her 2 remaining sons to her as she watched the end of her family's might, too afraid of the peasants to defend her dragons. At least her older son, Joffrey, had a man's spine. He stole his mother's dragon, Syrax, and tried to fly it to the dragon pit to save his birthright. But the stupid beast didn't understand, and twisted beneath him, fighting to be free of the little boy. Until it was. A queen is still a woman, with all the weakness of that sex. Weeping for her lost son more than her dragons, Rhaenyra abandoned the Iron Throne and sold her crown to buy passage for her and her last son back to Dragonstone. Rhaenyra hoped to hatch more dragons from the eggs in the castle. But when she landed, the welcoming party slew her guards and marched her and her son at spear point to the castle to face a dead man and a dying dragon. "Sister!" King Aegon, second of his name, called out to Rhaenyra. Rook's Rest had left Aegon bent and twisted, his once handsome face puffy from milk of the poppy, with burn scars covering half his body. Rhaenyra, ever defiant, told her dear brother that she'd hoped he was dead. "After you," Aegon answered. Then Sunfire bathed her in a blast of flame and devoured her in 6 bites when her son watched, leaving the 7th and final bite her lower leg, For the stranger.
Rhaenyra was dead, and King Aegon sat the Iron Throne again. But only for half a year. He was poisoned by his own men, and replaced with the very boy who had watched his mother devoured.
When Rhaenyra's last son wed Aegon's only daughter, the Dance of Dragons officially ended. Ashen burned men, all that was left of the Riverlands. 2 scared children spouting oaths they didn't understand, all that was left of the mighty house.